segue very nicely into the next presentation, which I'm very much looking forward to hearing. So we have a change in the speaker. So Dr. Kathy Baylis from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign is going to talk about behavioral expectations for barriers to adoption of post-harvest loss technology.
Thanks, Elizabeth. So this actually follows very much on, I think it's not quite your penultimate slide, but where you're talking about reasons for low adoption. I want to basically introduce you to a very new project for us. It's funded by the ADMI Institute at the University of Illinois. By the way, I'm an associate professor in agricultural and consumer economics. And in that, at that university, and this is very much a multidisciplinary, multi-country project where we're trying to understand both technologies that might be helpful to lower post-harvest losses and understand sort of various sort of preferences for those technologies and also barriers to adoption, reasons why folks might not adopt and what can be done about that. So in some ways it's very much in the lines of some of the things C.D. Glynn was talking about last night in terms of trying to understand not only the technologies but the whole sort of incentives along the sort of the supply chain, the value chain. I should also note this is, again, work that's jointly being done with colleagues from the Bihar Agricultural University and Rajendra Agricultural University who are here, Satish and Vishal Kumar, who've been great to work with, as well as with sort of several graduate students, again, Pallavi Shukla, who was supposed to be standing up here, Hemant Pulapotra, and Marin Skidmore, who've spent a good chunk of the last 6 months in Bihar working on this project. So, there we go. So, everybody knows the issue here, so we're looking at post-harvest loss, and in particular what we're going to be looking at is post-harvest loss in grains. You may wonder why grains, we look at post-harvest loss numbers in horticulture, they're much, much higher. We thought, all right, let's start simple, relatively simple. It already turns out to be quite complex. But if we can figure out some of the issues in terms of trying to get technology adoption in grains, perhaps we can learn something later on that might inform technology adoption in horticulture as well. We're looking at, particularly the 4 crops we're looking at are wheat, rice, lentils, and maize in Bihar. And you might wonder sort of why Bihar? Well, one of the reasons is that Bihar is one of the poorest states in India. About 80% of the population is involved in agriculture. Of that, 80% of those farmers are farming on lands that are smallholder and marginal farmers. There's average farm size is, again, half a hectare. Only about 7% of farmers have more than 2 hectares. So we're talking about, again, if you're looking at smallholders, Bihar is a good place to look at smallholders. There's also anecdotally lots of evidence of post-harvest loss in particularly these crops. So what we're trying to do is firstly, it's a relatively large project where we've got targeted 64 villages across 4 districts. We actually might be expanding up into the northeast as well. We're looking at about 50 households per village. And we also, what we've done is identified basically all of the traders that are acting in those 64 villages and are talking with them as well. And what we want to understand is, firstly, what are farmers doing now? What would they like to do? What are the traders doing now? What would they like to do? And then we actually want to try and drop in some technologies and see how well they work. All I'm going to be able to present today are some very, very initial summary stats from our baseline work, try and give you a sense of what the setting is and kind of what we're hearing in terms of constraints to adoption and things like that, and give you a sense of where we'd like to go. And I'm very much interested in comments from folks, particularly in this audience. So, coming at this, particularly working with my colleagues who are all sort of ag and biological engineers, the first thought is, well, okay, there are technological solutions here. what are the constraints? Well, one might be information. People don't know about these, right? Maybe it's just access to the technology, and that's sort of our kind of usual way of thinking, right? We just need to bring in technology, and let's see if folks pick it up. If they do, it's great, we're done. However, there's also issues, of course, cost of technology. It's pretty standard. We need to make sure that those technologies are affordable. However, what we're also finding from earlier work, some of which was also funded by the ADMI Institute, was that things like access to credit are huge. We're seeing the vast majority, for farmers in particular, we're seeing the vast majority of smallholder farmers borrowing from informal lenders whom they have to repay right at harvest. And so when we were talking to the farmers about, storing and why don't you store and wait for a higher price, we can't. We have to pay these guys back, so we sell right at harvest. There's also issues of market access. So some of the folks that did store, and now we're sitting on a bunch of grain that they can't actually sell. Because there are markets, basically a lot of the local, especially regulated markets, basically there's no transactions, they aren't actually operating more than 2 or 3 months after harvest. So you have these constraints, then you also have issues of incentives. And this is quite interesting for us. So when we talked with the farmers were saying, look, we know that maybe on average prices are supposed to go up over the season, but we don't actually see those increased prices. When we talked to the traders, they said, oh yeah, prices increase over the season. And we could get those. So there's definitely a bit of a disconnect there. We also were talking to people about how about incentives for quality, incentives for cleaning, incentives for drying, and the farmers were telling us basically they were seeing no financial incentives for any of those activities. So we've got, again, a bit of this mismatch. What I'm going to do is talk a little bit about sort of some evidence for some of these that we're seeing from our baseline survey, but happy to talk about the others as well, and we hope to get more into those later. So firstly, just in terms of technological availability, is it just access to technology? What we did is we just asked people what's available locally. Again, this is just very initial work. And basically, it was only 1 out of the 64 villages that has a sort of village level go down or sort of storage facilities. So you might think, well, if you're thinking access to storage is an issue, yes. The question is it a demand side issue or a supply side issue? Is there even sufficient demand for storage? And that's one of the questions we're hoping to tease out. There's also relatively little access to things like threshers. Again, the majority of villages don't have access to a thresher or don't have a thresher nearby. There's more mills. Most villages, well, about half villages have sort of 1 to 2 mills within the village. But again, it's still pretty limited. So is it access to technology? Maybe, right? There are some constraints there. But to have access to technology, you need to have demand for said technology. Technology is also relatively expensive and increasing in price. So when we're looking at things like, here's our combine harvesters, mechanical threshers, this is based on sort of data over the last, 4 years from 2010 to 2013. When folks do rent these things in, not many do, but when they do, it's expensive and the price has been increasing. About 50% for combine harvesters, for example. So again, price is an issue, maybe not a shocker. How about demand for technology? What incentives are there out there for people to actually use some of these technologies? Well, as I mentioned, the traders, when we asked them about, could you make money by storing? They're saying, yeah, prices are going up. But they still don't store. And we'll get into sort of some of the reasons why in just a second. Farmers, again, we're saying, look, there's just no incentives. We don't see higher prices down the road. We don't have necessarily access to markets. When we asked about grain quality, we asked traders sort of, do you care, what do you care about? They said, oh yeah, we care about moisture content. We care about brokens. We care about, shattering, cleanliness, all of that. And then we asked, well, how do you test it? It's basically scoop of grain in the hand, chomp on a seed, right? So my guess is that differentiating between like 14% moisture content and 12% moisture content might be a little tricky in that context, right? So therefore you have this sort of relatively coarse measure of quality, and therefore I think that's part of the reason that farmers aren't seeing necessarily high premium for different quality attributes coming to them, because there aren't really good metrics. However, when we talk to the end users, they're saying, yes, look, we're interested in moisture content. We're interested in having a constant flow of grain over time. We're also interested in pesticide-free production, but that's not getting down the supply chain. So again, technology is one piece, but also sort of being able to better align incentives is another piece that we're seeing. Again, so this is what traders are saying they're seeing in terms of prices. They are going up over time, but again, we see the vast majority of sales happening right at harvest. So again, there's kind of a disconnect. The traders themselves, when we say, okay, you're saying that you could make money by arbitrage, holding on to the grain, selling later, why don't you do it? And they say storage losses. So again, here, there might be a role for technology. There might be for improved storage facilities. When folks are saying where the losses are coming from, primarily rodent damage, some moisture and rotting, obviously connected. A smaller amount of insect damage, but again, this is sort of stated from the traders, what they're saying when they do store what they're seeing. You can't quite see it, but there's actually a fair bit of insects actually in that happy bag of grain. So I only have a little bit of time left. I just want to go to, again, this is the shameless self-promotion portion of the presentation. I want to talk a little bit about kind of next steps. And so right now what we're doing is we've got this household baseline survey underway. We're getting in some data again as we speak. What we want to do this fall is we're actually trying to do some field demonstrations of various storage technology, drying technology, and milling technology. Partially just to see how well it works in the field versus works at the agriculture universities. With that, then we're going to try and get a sense from the farmers what attributes of those technologies and traders do they like, do they not like, if we were going to tweak the technology to be more applicable to them, what tweaks would they like to see. So we're going to try and get at that. But then with the plan for basically the following year to roll out technology more broadly. Try and get a sense of adoption. We're going to do sort of an auction design where we ask farmers sort of how much they'd be willing to pay for these technologies and then allocate the technologies based on that, control treatment kind of groups. We are also going to be surveying the end users sort of more explicitly to understand their technology preferences and to try and also understand how can we link those folks a little more explicitly with the farmers so that that information flow works better along the supply chain. We're also going to be, so the hope is then when we drop in these technologies, if we see sufficient adoption, we can actually also go and measure what's the effect on the qualities being produced, quality of grain being produced at the farm level, the trader level, as well as getting a sense of quantity losses. Okay. Now, down the road, what we want to do is then sort of further, let me skip to the last slide. So down the road, what we want to do is we'd really like to try and twin some of these technology interventions with some other interventions that are meant to address these other barriers, like some credit. If farm credit is one of the barriers, is one of the things that are forcing people to sell right at harvest, not store, not do any post-harvest kind of treatments, what happens if we actually bring in some credit? Can we actually work with, again, end users to develop a contracting system? And so far, there sounds like there might be some interest. But again, the hope is that that'll at least allow the information flow to be a little more direct going to farmers, and then that might encourage adoption, or at least create the incentives for adoption. It's a very quick snapshot of what we're doing. Again, it's very early stages. But I think one of the things that I'm excited about in terms of this project is it's really trying to bring together both the technology side as well as understanding sort of the greater institutional side in making sure those things mesh. So we can actually not only have appropriate technologies, but get them in the system and get them to be beneficial for the smallholder farmers. That's it. Yeah.
So we have time for about 2 questions. There's one here in the front.
Thank you. I have 2 questions. How did you take into account the gender issue in your approach? And what do you call exactly technology? Is there appropriate technology, local or imported technology?
I'm embarrassed to say we haven't been working much on the gender issue yet. We know we've been remiss. So that's something we need to do a better job of doing, we haven't yet. I mean, we're trying to make sure we're talking to, in the baseline survey, we're trying to make sure we're talking to sort of an equal number of men and women, just to understand if they have differential preferences, and particularly for things like pesticide residue in grains, because right now a lot of the storage basically involves putting a pesticide tablet in the middle of your jute bag of grain, and and people say, oh yeah, don't worry, if you wash it, it all comes off. So we want to understand sort of different preferences within the household, but past that, that's the minimalist piece that we've done so far. We're hoping to expand that. It's a nice thing about being able to go back to these households for the next 3 years and actually get longitudinal information as we can try and correct our past mistakes. Your question about local technologies, this is where working with agricultural universities in Bihar has been very helpful in that we're trying to use technologies that can be accessed locally as much as possible. But this is part of the sort of this, what's going to be happening this fall is to try and understand, taking these sort of relatively off-the-shelf technologies, what do we need, what attributes do we need to tweak to make them function better in the field and be more likely to be adopted. I don't know if that answers your question.
Okay, we have time for one last question. I guess we'll go over here. You guys are the renegades sitting behind the rope there.
Thank you. It was a very nice presentation, and I'm very curious because I'm from Bihar myself, born, brought up, educated. I have 2 small suggestions because you are at the early stage of your studies.
Yes.
First suggestion is that emphasis on the crop is not similar all across the Bihar. Don't forget the north,
Yes.
which is frequently flooded.
Yes.
Emphasis on rice is very little.
Yes.
So please be careful. There's more emphasis on winter crops like wheat. So if you are talking about grain, which is not, I mean, the losses are much lesser in grain, and I'm a little bit surprised why you are putting a lot of energy on grains. You should have worked on horticulture because Bihar is number 2 or 3 largest horticulture producer in India. And if you could do anything to work on vegetable and fruits, that would go probably, much better for farming community, but especially the smallholders anyway. So, but emphasis if you have districts in the south of Bihar, probably then emphasis on the rice is okay because they are less, prone to flooding and all, and a lot of people, they have irrigation systems to grow the rice. So these few things, comes in mind very immediately. Thank you very much. I hope something good come out from it.
Thank you for the comment. No, we're actually just started working with BISA to work up in the northeast, which will hopefully bring in that different agroecology. I admit we started off being just horrendously practical in terms of we wanted to be sort of within spitting distance of the university, so if we did demonstrations at the universities, we could bring people in. But we recognize that, firstly, what we're doing now will not be representative of the state, but we're hoping to expand the project so that we can include more agroecosystems and maybe some other crops down the road. But no, thanks, appreciate it.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. That was great. Before I forget to ask, for those of you up in the control